On August 25, 2026, Dolly Parton died at 80, and America suddenly lost a voice that had lived inside weddings, heartbreaks, long drives, hard years, and ordinary lives. She also left behind an estimated $450 million fortune, built over 6 decades of songwriting, publishing, Dollywood, film, television, licensing, and business. 17 months earlier, she had lost Carl Dean, the fiercely private husband she had loved for nearly 60 years. After his death, Dolly admitted that while caring for him, she had let parts of her own health fall behind. Her representatives later said she had faced a brief battle with cancer. Yet she kept moving. She kept writing. She kept planning. Just 6 days before her death, her official website celebrated 82 new global sales certifications across 14 countries. Her Broadway musical was preparing to begin previews in December, with opening night scheduled for January 19, 2027. What would have been her 81st birthday. Her calendar still held a future. Her work still assumed she would be there. Dolly had built almost everything an artist could dream of, except more time. Now Carl is gone. Dolly is gone. They had no children together. So what happens to an estimated $450 million fortune when the two people at the center of that marriage are both no longer here? Behind the songs, properties, businesses, publishing rights, and decades of ownership lies one deeply personal question. Who inherits what Dolly Parton left behind? Yet money may be the smallest part of what is now at stake. An inheritance can be divided on paper. A legacy like Dolly's cannot. The harder question reaches beyond balance sheets. What happens to work woven into weddings and funerals, childhood memories and heartbreak, charities and institutions, and the lives of millions who felt Dolly understood them? Leave R.I.P. Dolly in the comments, and stay with us as we return to the poverty she rose from, the private losses she carried, the marriage she protected from fame, the fortune she built, and the legacy that now has to continue without her. To understand what Dolly Parton carried into those final years, the story has to return to the Tennessee mountains, to a little girl who learned about hardship, family, and loss long before the world learned her name. Dolly Rebecca Parton was born on January 19, 1946, near Sevierville, Tennessee, the fourth of 12 children raised by Robert Lee and Avie Lee Parton. The family lived in a small 2-room cabin on Locust Ridge, high in the Tennessee mountains, without electricity or indoor plumbing. The doctor who delivered Dolly was famously paid with a sack of cornmeal. Her father worked the land and took whatever labor was necessary to support the household. Her mother stretched food, clothing, music, and stories across 12 children. Robert Lee could not read or write, a fact that later troubled Dolly because she considered him deeply intelligent. Decades afterward, his struggle with literacy became one of the reasons she created the Imagination Library. Dolly once explained that her father's inability to read had always embarrassed him, even though she knew how capable he was. Poverty left marks on that family, but so did resourcefulness. Clothes were repaired, possessions were reused, and Avie Lee taught her children that worth was never the same thing as price. Grief arrived while Dolly was still a child. Her younger brother Larry lived only a few days after his birth, a loss that remained part of the Parton family story decades later. Dolly was only 9, growing up in a household where older children routinely helped care for the younger ones. Larry's life had barely begun before the family had to learn how to remember him. Another childhood wound survived in a different form. When the family could not afford a new coat, Avie Lee pieced one together from scraps of fabric. Dolly treasured it because her mother had made it. At school, other children saw poverty where Dolly saw love. Years later, that humiliation would become coat of many colors, one of the clearest signs that Dolly would never hide the place she came from. The coat would follow Dolly for the rest of her life, not because of what it cost, but because of what her mother had taught her to see inside it. Music was already giving Dolly a way to preserve what ordinary memory might have lost. She began writing songs as a young child, sang in church, absorbed the ballads and stories her mother carried, and watched a father without formal education build his life around work rather than complaint. The mountain home would eventually supply more than biographical color. Her father's literacy struggle became philanthropy. Her mother's scraps became a song recognized around the world. Family hardship gave Dolly subjects she could write about without pretending she had come from somewhere else. That refusal to erase her beginnings became one of her defining strengths. She would later build a public image filled with rhinestones, elaborate hair, and humor, yet the emotional vocabulary beneath it came from a family where very little was wasted. Not food, not fabric, and eventually, not memory. By the time Dolly began looking beyond East Tennessee, she already possessed what Nashville could never manufacture for her: a voice, a point of view, and stories her family had paid for in hardship long before anyone thought to put them on a record. Ambition pulled Dolly beyond the mountains while she was still young enough to need adults to help her reach the next town. By 1956, she was performing regularly on the Cass Walker Show in Knoxville. In 1959, at 13, she stepped onto the Grand Ole Opry stage, where Johnny Cash introduced her, and the audience called her back for 3 encores. That moment mattered because the sound of applause could still disappear by morning. Dolly had already recorded Puppy Love, and in 1962, she and her uncle Bill Owens signed with Tree Publishing and Mercury Records. Their major label single failed to chart, and the deal vanished. Talent had opened a door, but it had not promised that the door would stay open. After graduating from high school in 1964, Dolly went to Nashville almost immediately, carrying songs into a city that could reward them, reject them, or hand them to someone else. Music had been part of her childhood. Now it had to survive the harder test of becoming a life in a city already crowded with hopeful voices. Resistance became more specific in 1965, when Fred Foster signed Dolly and Bill Owens to combine Music and Monument Records. Monument initially pushed Dolly toward pop, even though country music was where her instincts were strongest. The early singles did little. The breakthrough came from the part of her talent Nashville could not easily ignore: songwriting. In 1966, country singer Bill Phillips recorded 2 Dolly Parton Bill Owens compositions that reached the top 10, including Put It Off Until Tomorrow. Dolly sang uncredited background vocals on that record. For a revealing stretch, her words were traveling farther than her name. Listeners could hear her voice in the background, while another artist stood at the center of the record. Then the records themselves began making the argument. Their success pushed Monument toward recording more country material, with Dolly at the microphone. Years later, she thanked my Uncle Bill Owens and Fred Foster for believing in me early on. That belief mattered. So did the evidence already traveling through other people's hits. Recognition began attaching itself to Dolly's own name in 1967. Dumb Blonde reached number 24 on the country chart. Something Fishy reached number 17. And Monument released her first full-length album, Hello, I'm Dolly. The record carried songs she had written that other artists had already taken onto the charts, quietly bringing the writer and performer back under the same name. Nashville no longer had to imagine whether Dolly's stories worked. It had heard them work. Now audiences could begin connecting the words, the mountain accent, the humor, and the woman herself. The album caught the attention of Porter Wagoner, whose television show would soon place Dolly before a much larger national audience. That opportunity would bring recognition faster than anything before it, but it would also create a more complicated test. Dolly had spent years persuading Nashville to hear her. Soon she would have to decide how much gratitude she owed the man who helped make her famous, and how much of herself she was willing to surrender in order to stay. Pressure sharpened just as Dolly Parton began to understand how far her own voice might carry. By the early 1970s, millions of Americans knew her from the Porter Wagoner Show, where she had performed since 1967 and become half of one of country music's most recognizable partnerships. Porter Wagoner had opened an important door for her, but Dolly had entered the arrangement intending to remain for only a limited period. According to her official history, she ultimately stayed 2 years longer than originally planned, even as tension increased behind the scenes, and her determination to build a solo career became harder to contain. Leaving, therefore, carried no simple emotion. The man beside her had helped introduce her to a national audience. The same partnership was becoming a place she could no longer remain without sacrificing the future she saw for herself. In 1974, Dolly finally chose separation. She did not turn that farewell into an attack. She turned it into, "I will always love you." Her explanation years later stripped the moment to its emotional core. "Just because I'm going, don't mean I won't love you." When she sang the song for Wagoner, he cried and told her she could leave if he was allowed to produce the record. The song reached #1. What looked like a chart victory had begun as a woman trying to leave with gratitude intact while refusing to disappear inside someone else's career. Defiance then had to survive repetition. Jolene, released in late 1973, had already shown that Dolly could hold an audience with little more than a name, a plea, and the unease inside a vulnerable story. Yet becoming unmistakably Dolly Parton required more than one great song. She had to keep crossing rooms where people already had an idea of what a country singer should sound like, look like, and become. Here You Come Again gave her a major crossover breakthrough in 1977, and 3 years later, Hollywood tested her in an entirely different way. 9 to 5 was Dolly's first film. She arrived so determined to be prepared that she had memorized the entire screenplay, including her co-star's lines, only to discover how much of filmmaking involved waiting. During that downtime, she began tapping her acrylic fingernails together, hearing in them the mechanical pulse of the office world depicted in the movie. That tiny rhythm became part of 9 to 5. The song raced to #1 on both the country and pop charts and earned 2 Grammy Awards. On a film set where almost everything was new to her, Dolly found a song in the sound beneath her fingertips. She watched, listened, wrote, and turned uncertainty into music. Persistence carried her through another decade in which remaining recognizable mattered as much as remaining successful. Tennessee Homesick Blues reached #1 on the country chart in 1984, and Why'd You Come In Here Lookin' Like That did the same in 1989. By then, the young singer once introduced beside Porter Wagoner had become a songwriter, actress, crossover star, and cultural presence in her own right. The harder victory, however, had happened long before the awards could measure it. Dolly had learned how to accept opportunity without allowing opportunity to own her. She could leave a partnership without erasing gratitude, enter pop without erasing Tennessee, and step onto a film set without abandoning the songwriter who had carried her there. Years later, discussing the satisfaction she received from her work, Dolly said, "My satisfaction comes from writing a song that means so much to me." She had spent decades proving that she could stand in her own name. Yet the strength behind that name had been shaped much earlier, in a crowded Tennessee home, by a mother who could turn scraps into dignity and scarcity into love. In December 2003, Dolly lost that woman. Avie Lee Parton was 80 when she died in 2003, taking with her a kind of closeness Dolly Parton could never recreate. She belonged to the years before records, movie sets, awards, Dollywood, or a face recognized around the world. Together with Robert Lee Parton, she raised 12 children in the Tennessee mountains, where money was limited and almost everything had to be stretched, repaired, reused, or shared. Yet Avie Lee measured abundance differently. She filled the home with songs, faith, stories, humor, and the difficult gift of noticing each child inside a family large enough for anyone to feel overlooked. Dolly remembered how her mother would announce that they were having stone soup, send the children outside to find the perfect stone, then carefully study everything they brought back. She praised each one before choosing the stone carried by the child she sensed needed a little extra affection that day. 12 children could be standing in front of her, and somehow Avie Lee still knew which heart needed to feel chosen. Years later, millions of strangers would know Dolly's name. None of them could know her in quite that way. Tenderness had already been sewn into the memory that would become one of Dolly's defining songs. When the family could afford little else, Avie Lee gathered scraps of fabric and made her daughter a winter coat, telling her the biblical story of Joseph while the needle passed through the cloth. To young Dolly, those mismatched pieces became beautiful because her mother had made them so. She wore the coat proudly to school. Other children saw poverty and mocked what Dolly believed was precious. The humiliation followed her home in memory, and years later, she transformed it into Coat of Many Colors. Dolly described the song through a mama's love, pride in who you are, the sting of judgment, and the courage required to stand against ridicule. The children at school had seen scraps. Avie Lee had already taught Dolly to see love. That difference would survive longer than the laughter. Dolly eventually became wealthy enough to own what the little girl in Tennessee could barely have imagined. Yet prosperity never improved the lesson stitched into that coat. Her mother had given it to her when there was almost nothing else to give. Time carried the song far beyond the mountain home where its story began. Coat of Many Colors became part of Dolly's cultural legacy, but its origin remained almost painfully ordinary. A mother working with a needle, discarded pieces of cloth, a story told to a child, and a little girl walking into school, believing that love might protect what the world was about to ridicule. Avie Lee died decades after that coat was made. Dolly could continue singing the memory, but the woman who had created it could no longer add another stitch, another story, another afternoon to their shared life. The coat remained, the song remained, the lesson remained. The hands that had given all three their meaning were gone. Dolly's life proved that poverty could not decide how far she would travel. Avie Lee had given her something harder to measure and impossible to replace: the knowledge that worth could exist long before the world recognized it. Once, a few pieces of unwanted cloth covered a little girl facing the laughter of other children. Decades later, those same scraps still carried her mother's answer to that laughter. Your value begins before the world learns how to recognize it. Dolly would carry that lesson for the rest of her life. Years later, another loss would reach her through a different part of the family story: through music. Floyd Estelle Parton died on December 6, 2018, at 61, leaving Dolly with an absence written into music. He had grown up beside her in the same Tennessee family of 12 children, surrounded by faith, work, stories, and songs long before any of them knew how far Dolly's voice would travel. Floyd found his own place inside that inheritance. He wrote Nickels and Dimes and, most famously, Rockin' Years, recorded by Dolly and Ricky Van Shelton, and taken to #1 on the country chart in 1991. His obituary remembered him as a songwriter, outdoorsman, nature lover, and accomplished cook who remained closely tied to Sevierville. His memorial was private, and no cause of death was publicly announced. Dolly later described the family's farewell with striking restraint. We all sang his lovely song, Rockin' Years, together as a family, at the service to say goodbye to him. Then she added, he lived a short life of love and beautiful songs. No embellishment was needed. A brother was gone. His family answered with the words he had once given them. Rockin' Years imagines love stretching into old age, two people remaining together through the decades that slowly turn youth into memory. Floyd had written toward that distant horizon. He died at 61. At the service, the Partons sang lyrics written by the man they were there to mourn. The song promised years ahead. Floyd had no more years to add. His own work had become part of his goodbye. The family also asked that memorial donations be directed to the My People Senior Activity Center in Sevierville, keeping Floyd's remembrance connected to the Tennessee community that had shaped the Partons before fame changed the scale of their lives. He had written about staying through the years. At his memorial, those words remained in the voices of the people who loved him. Their writer could not add another year. Afterward, Rockin' Years returned to the strange permanence music gives its creators. Floyd's name remained in the credits. The recording could still begin whenever someone pressed play. Dolly and Ricky Van Shelton could still be heard singing lines he had written decades earlier. A recording could preserve Floyd's words, his melody, and the name printed beside them. It could not give his family another year with the man who wrote them. Dolly had spent her life proving that music could carry feeling beyond the moment that created it. Floyd's death exposed the harder side of that gift. His words were still growing older in the ears of listeners. The man who wrote them never would. By then, Dolly understood that absence did not always arrive in the same form. Some losses ended a life. Others belonged to futures that had once been imagined clearly enough to feel almost real. Motherhood had once seemed ordinary enough to assume. When Dolly Parton and Carl Dean were young, they did not enter marriage expecting that children would remain outside their story. Dolly later remembered, "We just assumed we would have kids. They were not trying to prevent it," she explained, "and they had even chosen names. We even had names if we did, but it didn't turn out that way." The ache in that memory comes from how specific the future had once felt. Those names never became children growing into them. Years moved forward, and the family Dolly and Carl had once assumed would arrive never took shape. Health problems would later make that reality even harder to escape, but the loss existed before any medical explanation could contain it. It was the disappearance of an ordinary future they had once expected, without knowing they might need to mourn it. Family entered their life in other forms. 5 of Dolly's younger brothers and sisters lived with her and Carl for years, while nieces and nephews became part of the household and emotional world around them. With time, Dolly began to understand that the life she had received carried possibilities the life she had imagined might not have allowed. Speaking with Oprah Winfrey in 2020, she said, "Since I had no kids, and my husband was pretty independent, I had freedom. That freedom gave her room to travel, write, build businesses, support relatives, and keep working at a scale few performers could sustain. But freedom did not erase the road that had once pointed somewhere else." The family simply widened. Family visits, nieces, nephews, younger siblings, and helping relatives gave the household a different kind of fullness. Dolly stopped measuring love only by the shape she had expected when she married, and began recognizing the forms in which it had arrived. It was different from the family once planned, but it was family. Years later, that widened idea of family became one of the most enduring choices of her life. Dolly came to say that perhaps she had not been meant to have children so that everybody's kids could be mine. In 1995, she launched the Imagination Library. What began by mailing free books to children in her home county grew far beyond Tennessee, placing books directly into homes across countries and generations. The image was simple enough to hold: a child finding a book addressed to them, their own name on something meant to be opened and kept. Dolly and Carl had once chosen names for children who never came. Decades later, countless other names were arriving on books because Dolly had chosen to direct time, money, and care outward. She could not reopen the future that had closed. She could decide where the love prepared for that future would go. The children she once imagined never arrived. The care she had imagined giving them did not disappear. It found millions of other names to carry. But that acceptance belonged to the woman Dolly became much later. Decades earlier, before she could make peace with that absence, her body and mind had already carried her into one of the darkest periods of her adult life. Success could not protect Dolly Parton from what was happening inside her own body. By the early 1980s, the woman audiences saw moving between hit records, films, television appearances, and punishing schedules was also living with serious gynecological problems that could no longer be pushed aside. In 1982, she underwent emergency surgery after years of what she publicly called female problems. She later spoke openly about endometriosis and a partial hysterectomy. For a woman who had built much of her life around motion, the medical crisis imposed something she had rarely allowed herself: a stop. Dolly later described being away from work for roughly 18 months and remembered it as a lonely time, because she had never before stopped working or staying busy. Audiences still associated her with rhinestones, humor, movies, and songs that seemed to carry endless energy. Dolly was suddenly living inside days where ambition could not command the body forward. Work had always filled the silence. Now the silence remained whether she wanted it or not. Emotional strain deepened that isolation. Dolly later described becoming intensely attached to someone in what she called an affair of the heart, and when that bond ended, the loss entered a life already weakened by illness, exhaustion, and distance from the work that had long structured her days. She remembered crying an ocean, and later acknowledged reaching an extremely dark emotional point. Her body had forced her to stop. Her routines had vanished. A private relationship had broken apart. For the first time in years, the relentless momentum that had structured much of her adult life was gone. Faith became part of the interruption. So did her little dog Popeye, whose presence Dolly later connected with a moment that helped break through the darkness. Nothing changed at once. The illness remained. The heartbreak remained. Recovery arrived in smaller pieces. Enough strength to face another day. Enough faith to believe the future had not closed. Enough willingness to begin moving again. Work eventually became one of the doors back. Dolly later described Rhinestone as unexpectedly important during her recovery, and credited Sylvester Stallone's energy with being healing for her. The film would never define her career, yet its place in her life mattered for another reason. It returned movement after a period of forced stillness. Songwriting gave pain somewhere to go. Dolly once explained that writing allowed her to express feelings she might otherwise have carried alone, and that habit became part of how she found her way back. Records followed. Films followed. Touring and business followed. The woman celebrated for helping other people feel lighter had learned how little public brightness could reveal about a private collapse. She rebuilt momentum piece by piece, and proved that stopping had not meant ending. Years later, however, resilience would face a wound that work could not repair. The next great absence would come from the man who had stood beside her through nearly every version of the life she had fought to rebuild. Carl Dean had known Dolly Parton before the world did. They met in Nashville in 1964 when she was 18 and married 2 years later. For nearly 6 decades, Carl remained almost entirely outside the machinery of her fame. Dolly crossed from country music into film, built Dollywood, created businesses, traveled the world, and became one of America's most recognizable women. Carl preferred privacy. She once summed up their contrast simply: "He's quiet, and I'm loud." Their marriage, she said, endured through love, respect, and humor. "We love each other, we respect each other, but we have a lot of fun." When they renewed their vows for their 50th anniversary in 2016, Dolly joked that she was dragging him into the next 50 years with her. They were given 9 more. On March 3, 2025, Carl died in Nashville at 82. Dolly's announcement was spare. "Carl and I spent many wonderful years together. Words can't do justice to the love we shared for over 60 years." His funeral remained private, attended by immediate family. Days later, Dolly turned again to the language that had carried so much of her life. She released "If You Hadn't Been There" for Carl, and wrote that she had fallen in love with him at 18 and spent 60 meaningful years beside him. "Like all great love stories, they never end," she wrote. Yet grief soon changed even her relationship with songwriting. By July, Dolly admitted, "Several things I've wanted to start, but I can't do it," adding, "I can't afford the luxury of getting that emotional right now." That admission cut deeper, because writing had once helped her survive other crises. This time, the words themselves could open too much. The marriage she remembered was built from ordinary hours as much as grand milestones. She said she and Carl could spend an entire day together and exchange only a few words, then talk for hours at night. That was where his absence became hardest to replace. Carl had occupied the hours without cameras, applause, or performance. Dolly could be recognized almost everywhere in the world and still have one person beside whom recognition did not matter. When he was gone, that private world lost the person who had made it ordinary. The hardest adjustment was not memory, it was the future. Dolly later said she could still feel Carl's presence, but acknowledged that it could not replace the loss and the loneliness of it. She also admitted that learning to make new plans was the hardest part. Caring for Carl had pushed some of her own medical needs aside. Dolly later said, "I am dealing with some health issues that I just didn't pay attention to when I was watching over Carl." Treatments followed. Appearances were reduced or postponed. Yet she continued working. Near the end of her life, she described herself as still healin' and still workin'. Carl had occupied nearly all of Dolly's adult past. After March 2025, she had to learn how to imagine a future without him. It was a future she was still trying to build when her own health began demanding more of her than she had allowed herself to notice. Shattering was how little distance remained between Dolly Parton's plans for tomorrow and the day tomorrow stopped belonging to her. Even at 80, she was still looking forward. On August 19, 2026, only 6 days before her death, Dolly appeared virtually to accept the ACM Poets Award. Songwriting, she said, had been her therapy, her release, and a gift from God. 2 days later, she was still talking about the work ahead and the things she hoped to accomplish. Around her, the future remained crowded with plans. Dolly, a true original musical, was moving toward Broadway. The Life of Many Colors Museum and Songteller Hotel were taking shape in Nashville. After losing Carl Dean, Dolly was still learning how to imagine tomorrow without the man who had shared nearly 60 years of her life. Yet she was imagining it, still healing, still working, still reaching toward whatever came next. Then, on August 25th, Dolly Parton died in Nashville at 80. Initial reports did not name a cause. Her representatives later said she had faced a brief battle with cancer. 6 days separated an award, celebrating her words from a world in which no new words from Dolly would ever arrive. Silence meant something different when it followed a woman who had spent a lifetime filling the world with sound. Jolene could still begin with the same urgent guitar. Coat of Many Colors could still carry listeners toward a Tennessee childhood, stitched together from poverty, pride, and a mother's love. I Will Always Love You could still make departure sound tender. 9 to 5 could still move with the restless rhythm of working lives. The recordings remained exactly where Dolly had left them. The woman behind them did not. There would be no next first take, no lyric arriving unexpectedly, no new joke delivered with that familiar mixture of mischief and wisdom. Tributes spread across music, film, Tennessee, and far beyond. Reba McEntire, Dolly's longtime friend and fellow country icon, distilled the loss into a single line: "There will never ever be another you." Jane Fonda, Dionne Warwick, Paul McCartney, and artists across generations added their own farewells. Yet the public tributes could only describe the Dolly they had known. For family, friends, collaborators, and those who had shared years of ordinary life with her, the loss existed beyond headlines and public memory. Inside conversations, shared work, laughter, long familiarity, and private histories the rest of the world would never fully know or measure. For everyone else, another certainty had disappeared: the quiet belief that Dolly Parton would somehow always still be here. Unfinished work made that absence almost visible. The future still contained dates with Dolly's name attached to them. Her Broadway musical was moving toward a stage she would never see in its next form. The Life of Many Colors Museum was preparing to tell her story, while the woman whose life filled that story had become history herself. Songteller Hotel was approaching its planned opening. Other creative projects and businesses remained in motion. A project begun while she was alive could open its doors in a world without her. A song she had written decades earlier could still become someone else's first encounter with Dolly. The calendar could keep advancing through dates she had expected to reach. Her life had stopped. The movement she created had not. While her health had increasingly asked her to slow down, much of what she had built was still accelerating toward a future she would never reach. Enduring, then, did not mean pretending Dolly was somehow still present. It meant recognizing how much presence a life can leave behind. She had spent decades carrying people she loved after they were gone. Avi Lee in stories and songs, Floyd in music and memory, Carl in the private history of a marriage that had shaped her adulthood. On August 25th, that responsibility changed hands. The people who had listened to Dolly, worked beside her, learned from her, laughed with her, or simply found comfort in her voice, would now become the keepers of hers. The records kept turning. The stages kept waiting. The projects kept moving toward dates she would never see. And somewhere, in a room Dolly Parton would never enter, someone pressed play, and her voice began again. By the end of Dolly Parton's life, fame had become the least interesting measure of what she had built. Records sold, awards won, films made, businesses created, decades of applause. Those things could describe scale, but they could not explain why people who had never met Dolly felt they knew where to find her when life turned difficult. The deeper evidence lived elsewhere, in a family hearing dignity instead of shame inside coat of many colors, in someone facing separation and finding tenderness inside I will always love you, in a young performer looking at a woman from the Tennessee mountains and seeing permission to be ambitious without becoming someone else. Dolly became one of the most recognizable women on earth while refusing to treat the place that formed her as something to outgrow. The farther her life traveled, the more clearly East Tennessee remained inside the stories she chose to send back. That girl, who had once sung in the Tennessee mountains, never vanished beneath the heels, rhinestones, cameras, or applause. What shaped her most deeply was the way she learned to transform absence. Life repeatedly changed the future she thought she understood. A mother disappeared from the world that had formed her. A brother left behind songs that would keep aging without him. The children she and Carl once imagined never arrived in the form they expected. Her own body forced her through a season when work could no longer carry her past exhaustion and despair. And after nearly 60 years of marriage, she had to discover what tomorrow meant without Carl beside her. Dolly did not turn those losses into one lesson or one kind of strength. She found different places for love to go. Memory became music. Family widened beyond biology. Care became books, opportunities, wages, jobs, donations, and institutions that reached strangers. By the end of her life, the Imagination Library alone had distributed more than 300 million books. Sorrow reached Dolly again and again. She refused to let sorrow be the only thing that survived. That may be why people trusted a woman whose public image was deliberately larger than life. The rhinestones caught the light. The hair rose higher. Her laugh could arrive before a room had decided how seriously to take her. Then the song would begin, and underneath the spectacle were feelings that required no fame to understand. Wanting to belong, fearing loss, missing home, wondering what might have been, trying to stand after life had changed shape. Dolly could make thousands of people laugh while carrying grief that applause could not repair. She could write about poverty without making poor people small, heartbreak without making love foolish, and ambition without pretending success solved loneliness. The image was spectacle. The feeling was recognition. Her gift was not the promise that difficult lives become easy. She showed that a difficult life could still make room for humor, usefulness, generosity, work, beauty, and the possibility of giving someone else a little more courage than you had been given. And perhaps that is the truest measure of Dolly Parton's legacy. Long before the world had to say goodbye, she had already given herself away in pieces. A melody someone reached for on a hard night, a book placed into a child's hands, a laugh that made embarrassment easier to survive, a story that restored dignity to a place others might have dismissed. A little courage, borrowed from a woman who had spent her own life climbing. Legacy, in Dolly's case, was never waiting for death to begin. It had already begun. It had been moving through other people for decades. If Dolly ever gave you a song, a smile, or a little courage when you needed it, leave one simple line: R.I.P. Dolly Parton. Her greatest achievement may not have been how far she climbed from those Tennessee mountains. It was how much she kept sending back down for everyone still making the climb.